We're going to talk to Dame Anne Owers. She's the National Chair of the Independent Monitoring Boards, or IMB, which provides oversight of the treatment and care of prisoners. In a report out today, it's an exclusive for Woman's Hour, the IMB have found women are being sent to prison as a place of safety, whilst experiencing severe mental health problems. Some women were sent to prison because they had attempted suicide. Some had been diagnosed with a severe mental illness and needed medication, and there was no adequate community provision. Of 6 women sent to one local prison for their own protection, only three, had been transferred to a mental health hospital 6 months later. Well, the women we're talking about here have solely been sent to prison on mental health grounds. They have not been charged with other crimes. The report also looks into instances of self-harm by these women in prison, which we'll get into in a moment as well. But Dame Anne Owers, thank you very much for coming on Woman's Hour. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you.
Can you tell us more about what you found? Because it's quite extensive, but what are the headlines here? What do we need to know about?
Well, I think here we're talking about women who would not otherwise have been sent to prison except for their mental health concerns. And as you say, some of the findings in our report are shocking. A woman who was wandering on a railway line, a woman who was threatening to throw herself off a bridge, a woman who had no home and had severe mental health concerns, but there was no community provision. So, and in one London prison over a year, there was an average of 5 women a month sent on these grounds. We don't know the total statistics because nobody keeps the data. But what we do know is that these women are in prison. Prison is not the right place for them. It's not a therapeutic environment. And the levels of self-harm in women's prisons are increasing and are very high. 22% of all self-harm incidents in prison are from women, and they're only 4% of the population. So that is also a very shocking statistic.
And can I just rewind a bit to be clear, because these women haven't committed a crime, have they? Or even a small crime? Are they criminals?
They may have. There may be a public order offence. There may be public nuisance, for example. But for trespass, for example. But it's not something for which otherwise they would end up in custody. And custody is not the right place for them, because the reason that they are doing these things is because they are mentally ill, not because they are criminals.
And they need help, presumably, and they need a safe environment. Prison, I presume, is not going to be that therapeutic environment. What effect is putting these women into a prison setting?
Well, it's not, as you say, a therapeutic environment. And so what we know is that the rates of self-harm among women are very high. There was one woman, for example, in our report, who had 98 incidents of self-harm, 8 of which required hospitalisation. There was another prison where there were 295 incidents of self-harm in 1 month. There's one woman who was self-harming 20 times a day. These are women who are clearly ill, and for whom prison is not providing the kind of environment that they should have.
Can it make them worse, do you think?
Well, of course it can. Of course it can make them worse. It's not. For example, if you are very severely ill and your behaviour is very challenging because of that, there's a strong chance you'll end up in a segregation unit, in the deepest form of imprisonment there is. And that's not because of staff and mental health staff and prison staff aren't doing their best. They absolutely are. But it's because the need is much greater than the resources available, and prison is not the right place for such people.
We talk on Woman's Hour a lot about how prisons are overstretched. There aren't enough staff to look after the prisoners that there are. So putting women who are vulnerable in that situation, who need extra care, surely it's stretching it to the max even more. Are they able to cope?
Of course it is. Of course it is. And no one working in prison wants to be dealing with this. But what we also know is that though there is guidance that women who are severely mentally ill should be moved to secure mental accommodation within 28 days, that doesn't happen. That is not routinely happening. And I think what we need to look at is the other side of the equation, and that is the absence of sufficient community provision, either mental health care in the community or mental health care in secure establishments. There simply isn't enough of it.
Well, I was going to ask, where can these women go? Is there anywhere else to put them? Is there any solution?
Well, the solution is, and always has been, providing proper care in the community. What we know at the moment, for example, is that Parliament is debating a mental health bill, which says that women should not, any person should not be sent to prison solely on mental health grounds, should not be sent to prison as a place of safety, and that there should be a statutory time limit of 28 days for moving people into mental hospitals. Now, that's all great, but it's a bit like having a bill that tries to prevent homelessness without building any houses. Unless you're going to provide the proper accommodation, proper services in the community, there is nowhere else for these women to go at the moment. And we are going in entirely the wrong direction on this. That when the female offender strategy was published in 2018, the promise was that there would be more community care, that there would be alternatives to custody, that it would reduce the number of women in prison. What we've seen now in the most recent prisons white paper produced by the government is 500 more prison places for women. Now, that for me is entirely the wrong place to invest. We need to be investing in not prison, not investing in more prison.
How do you feel about that when you saw that white paper?
Well, just that, as I say, that it was going in the wrong direction. That what we know is that there should be more appropriate settings for women for all kinds of areas, but most particularly for women with mental health concerns, where prison is not the right place to deal with those concerns.
And is it happening to women more than it is to men?
We don't know that the use of these powers is happening more for women because we don't have the statistics. But what we do know is that self-harm and mental illness among women in prison is high and higher than in the male population. So we know that we have got a serious difficulty in prisons and that it is much more acute for women.
So who is to blame then? In your eyes, who do you think is at fault here? Why is this happening?
Well, it's happening because we're not investing sufficient in mental health services outside prison. Prison is being used as a capacious mental health provision because there aren't enough services outside. What we need is a redistribution of resource so that there is resource available in the community, available early so that women do not get into crisis and men don't get into crisis for that matter, but that we don't use prison as the default setting for women who need mental health support.
Well, the government have sent a spokesperson and told us that while custody is always a last resort for women, with numbers having fallen by a quarter since 2010, we remain committed to ending the use of prisons as a place of safety. We are investing millions into community services like women's centres and drug rehabilitation so even fewer end up in prison, and continuing to improve support for the most vulnerable women by providing specialist support for psychological trauma, round-the-clock helplines and improving training for staff. What do you say to that, Anne?
Well, that would be great. I mean, I would look for.
Well, they say they're doing it, but what have you seen?
It's not happening now, is all I can say. The statistics that we've just produced, that we've just been talking about, the extent of self-harm in women's prisons, the extent of mental illness in women's prisons, shows that this is not happening now. And it would be wonderful if the resource and the thought and the planning went into that, but it needs to be there now, not as a promise.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you for coming on the show. That's Dame Anne Owers, National Chair of the Independent Monitoring Boards, which oversee care of prisoners.